Welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. My name is Austin Chadwick and my co-host is Chris Lucian. And very excited to have Dan Puckett today with us to be talking about experimenting and experiments he's ran with mob programming and Scrum teams. Also, we'll try to hit cycle time, throughput quality, employee satisfaction, and mobbing's impact on that, and the twin principles of invitation and experimentation. And so a lot of great stuff lined up. And we'll see what we get to. But before we jump into it, Dan, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you, Austin. Thank you, Chris. My name is Dan Puckett. I'm a Agile transformation consultant. I've been working as a coach and a consultant in the Agile field. That's kind of my mindset for maybe the past decade or so. I started out in life as a little baby programmer right out of college, green as the grass, right? Pulled into a large telecommunications firm. So I was working on large telecommunication systems. From there, I moved. That's where I learned what the consequences are of working in a waterfall kind of model, where everyone's sort of stuck in their little cubicle and works on their tiny part of the huge piece. From there, I moved into an operations role. I supported a configuration management tool called ClearCase. For those of your listeners who have familiarity with that, my condolences on that. Other products are available. At the time, it was highly capable, but I was on a helpline for a while, doing kind of break fix sort of work. I carried a pager back when that was a thing, and that gave me some insight into what it's like to work in an environment where it's more of a service model rather than developing a product, as it were. From there, I got an opportunity to become a Scrum Master and learn to start making mistakes in that kind of arena. From there, I moved into a role as an Agile trainer, moved into an Agile coaching role, and here I am. My emphasis for the past couple of years has been around, my enthusiasm, I suppose, has been around bringing the practice of mobbing into existing Scrum teams. And that's something that I've gotten really interested in. What's it like not bringing it into a kind of a greenfield team, but a team that has a certain amount of experience within Scrum? What's it like to bring mobbing into that environment?
That's fantastic. And for me, this topic fascinates me because I spent about 4 to 5 years doing, at a Scrum shop, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And we did a little bit of experimenting with mobbing there. And also Dan got to visit mob with us. So it's fun to see Dan as well again. But I guess to start us off, let's jump right into that topic. When did you start doing this, I guess? When did you start experimenting with mobbing and Scrum?
Let's see. So at this point, it'd have to be a couple years ago, I'd say. I was working as an Agile coach at a large financial services firm, about 50,000 employees. I was going through a major Agile transformation. Top to bottom, mixed results, as you might expect. And it's hard to say anything for sure in an organization that size, right? Some parts are going to be doing really well, and other parts are just going to be getting started on their journey. My emphasis was working in an area where there were teams that had been working together for maybe 2 or 3 years. Right? And in a company that large, there's a lot of teams there. So there's always a new team to come in, and so you get your kind of your pick of who you want to work with there. And I had the luxury of being able to stick up my hand and say, anybody out there interested in mobbing or mob programming, let me know. And we can run a little experiment in your team. And inevitably, a bunch of people are not very interested, but some people are like, "Yeah, I'm interested in that. Can you help us with that?" So that's the context in which I did a lot of this work.
Mm-hmm. What gave you? I guess what was the initial, or what was your initial introduction to mobbing? What gave you the idea to introduce it at that location?
Yeah, I've been working in that mode in one way or another for many years now. Okay. And so I frequently talk about mobbing rather than mob programming, because a lot of my experiences with mobbing have been outside of a programming context.
Okay.
As an example, I worked at as a Agile coach at a company that made those gray cylindrical electrical meters that go on the side of your house.
Okay.
So I worked on a team that had a Scrum team working in 1 week sprints, but they had software, firmware, hardware, and mechanical people, all in mechanical. It sounds like the Tin Man, but
Yeah.
someone who made like the housing of it, right? They're all working together on the same Scrum team to develop the next version of one of these meters. And it's interesting because their roles are all very dependent on each other. The requirements of the hardware constrain how you size the housing, which also constrains what you can put together in terms of supporting the firmware, which constrains the software. So they all need to work together. I've got a photo in my computer somewhere of these folks mobbing together and sort of all crammed together into a tiny room. And they're all staring at the same screen at the same time. But up on the screen is a spreadsheet. And they're putting together the bill of materials for what they planned for putting this together. They needed to get this bill of materials together so they could figure out what the target price is for this thing. So, okay, we had this many of this component, so it's going to cost this much and so on. So get a rough sense of what that is, but they all needed to contribute to that. And they were just mobbing in a standard way to put together this bill of materials. And that's one example of the kind of context in which I've applied this outside of programming.
Fantastic. Okay, so you ask for volunteers, and then some people are ready to go, and others are kind of disinterested. I imagine you take the people that are ready to go and get started. And so what does that look like? I guess, what impacts did it have on the team? I think it's interesting because, ceremonies might be affected and things like that. Like, I guess, what impact did mobbing have on Scrum once a Scrum team started mobbing? I think those are all really interesting questions.
Yeah. Well, so let me walk you through like how I might do one of these engagements, because maybe that'll give you a sense as to how the conversation would go. So Scrum, typically it's a Scrum Master, because they're all sort of fired up. Well, some of them are fired up, right? But they're like, yeah, could you bring that in? It might be valuable. I'm like, okay, great. So the first meeting we have is with the Scrum Master, usually the Scrum Master plus the management of any of the people on the team. So I have a meeting with these folks just separate from the rest of the team. The reason why I do this is that if they have any questions, I want to make sure they have a chance to ask them in a way where they get them answered in private. Like, so they don't, number one, they don't look dumb in front of the team in case they've got an ego around that. Number two, they're able to speak freely. Like, if they have any concerns, I want them to feel free to bring it up, so that when we do go in front of the team, they can be like, yeah, I'm ready to go, right? So they're not sort of shooting arrows at me while I'm trying to pitch to the rest of the team. But essentially, I give them the spiel, which is this. I'd like to propose, if you're into it, that we try mobbing with your team. Now, here are some of the results I've gotten with some of the teams I've worked with before, but results are not guaranteed here. Here's what I do guarantee. I can dedicate a month of my time to you and your team, 2 hours a day, every single working day, for the team to work together as a mob. On your side, your team will need to devote 2 hours a day, every working day, to working together as a mob. Now, the kind of work you'll be doing is not we're not going to do fizz-buzz, right? We're not going to do some weird toy problem here. This is going to be real work. This is work that you've planned into your sprints. So this is not extra work, right? This is just work you would have done anyway. Nothing special about this, but you're going to be working in this new way. At the end of this month, what you will have are some concrete results on the effects on cycle time, throughput, quality, and employee satisfaction with regards to this practice. Now, at the end of the month, you'll get a presentation. If you're in management, you won't be engaged usually unless you decide to join us. But at the very least, if you do nothing else, at the end of the month, you'll have an opportunity for the team to present to you what they accomplished, what they felt that they learned, the changes they decided to make as they went through this, and the concrete results in terms of those different factors as they went through. And then at the end of it, I'm going to ask the question, which is, what would you like to do with this information? if nobody sticks up their, if like there's dead silence, right? No one sticks up their hand, and I sort of slowly back out of the room and we forget this ever happened, right? The default is that no change happens. However, that would be a moment if someone wants to continue in this mode, they could stick up their hand and say, I'd like to keep doing this, or I'd like to keep doing some version of this, at which point then they get to take it on. But the default is not to make a policy change until you've actually given it a try and seen the effects in your team. Only then would I ask that you make any kind of permanent change. So that's kind of the pitch going into this.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, what I really love about it is your kind of routine here is the transparency of it, right? You're not, at times, I guess in transparency of myself, if I felt like I was thrown in an organization, I'd be tempted to be like, let's go do it in a dark corner where no one knows, you know what I mean? And like, and let's make good things happen, but I love that you're very transparent and open, and you want to address the concerns publicly and be very explicit about what the experiment is and what it isn't. And that I think a month seems like a pretty good number, because I think we in other conversations I've had, it's been like, oh yeah, I tried momming and it didn't work because I tried it for an hour on some code I didn't like, you know what I mean, with people I don't get along with. And it's like, well, there's some learning curve time to actually give something a real shot. And so I find that admirable. And I think thinking specifically of Scrum, what are things, levers in a typical Scrum team you come into that are helpful to running this kind of experiment? And maybe what are things that are challenges or barriers to running this kind of experiment in a Scrum team?
Well, there's honestly, the whether the team is doing Scrum or not matters a lot less than you might think. Now, there are some very nice things about coming into a Scrum team and applying it in a Scrum team. Number one, if you're in a Scrum team, you probably have some kind of Agile lifecycle management tool that you've been using. And many of them are available. Some of your listeners might be using one right now. But naming no names, probably somewhere in that tool, you're able to get certain statistics out of it. And specifically statistics around cycle time and throughput. In a Scrum context, we talk about velocity rather than throughput, right? But if you're on a Scrum team, somewhere you'll probably be able to figure out for your team's velocity, which is how many story points are we able to complete in the length of a sprint. You've got that calculation in there somehow. If not, it's pretty easy to get. The other one is usually less straightforward to get, but you can still pull it out of the tool pretty straightforward way, which is what I'm calling cycle time. Mm-hmm. For those of your listeners who aren't familiar with the term cycle time, or maybe not how I'm using it here, cycle time is the amount of time from the moment someone starts working on a story to the moment the last person on the team finishes the story and it meets the definition of done for that team. How long is that? So is that 2 hours, 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months? Hopefully not 2 months, right? But how long is that? And it doesn't take too much fiddling with whatever your Agile lifecycle management tool is to be able to find historical data on that. What this allows me to do is to look at the time periods that the team was working in a mobbing context, and then extract cycle time and throughput out of those 2 hour time periods per day, and then calculate and then make apples to apples comparisons. Now, there is a little bit of fiddling you need to do to the units to make the units comparable. But you can do it, and you can actually answer the most common question that I get from people who hear about mobbing for the first time, which is, how could this possibly be efficient? Right? I frequently hear it from managers, but very often I also hear it from engineers who have a manager hat, which they have in the closet they can put on, right? How could this possibly be efficient, right? Mobbing sounds great, but if we've got 4 people moving at 1/4 of the speed that they would if we send them back to their cubes, maybe it's not worth it, right? with this kind of data in here, we can actually figure out what are the effects on cycle time, throughput, quality, and employee satisfaction, and actually get some answers to those questions.
Okay, cool. Fantastic. So I think in some contexts, the tool can be a four-letter word for some people, right? But in this case, you can actually utilize it and to help them have some transparency about what's going on, which I find phenomenal. That's great. What are some things that have been challenges in Scrum teams to overcome, like either with their ceremonies or maybe with everything used to being tracked individually or things like that? How do you handle that?
Yeah, well, so in this particular experiment, and I'm just talking about the 1 month experimental period, right? The only guidance I really give them is you have to pick something that's planned into the current sprint. Just pick something. Now, that said, there are some rules of thumb I would give them. Number one would be to choose something that requires the skills of the whole team, or as much as possible, right? If you pick something where it's only, where you've got Fred is the database administrator and the only one on the team, and it's database administration work, then unless you are really invested in having everyone kind of learning that skill, there's going to be a lot of Fred talking and nobody else talking during this. Maybe that's exactly what you want, but just know ahead of time that you'll be going into that. So that would be one aspect. I had one team, for example, the work they had to do at that moment, and there's always some dumb, dorky, stupid work that you have to do in any job. The item that they pulled this time is they had to make 6 different requests to enter into a ticketing system to get other teams to do stuff. And so to make these requests, they had to cut and paste a lot of stuff. And so at one point, I found myself in a room facilitating a session where 5 engineers were cutting and pasting from one spot to another in these trouble tickets. Trust me, you don't need 5 first-class minds to accomplish that task, right? But they did it, right? They had a good time. If you have to do something stupid, at least you got friends there. But that's maybe not the best way to spend your day. So choose something that really requires a wide range of skills, and it'll feel a lot better. That would be one thing. The second tip I give to teams is that in sprint planning, choose a story which you are going to exclusively do in your mobbing sessions. So this particular story, we're only going to work on it during mobbing. Nobody else touch it outside of mobbing. Right? The reason I ask this is that, number one, we don't need to bring people up to speed. The mob is already loaded in on whatever it is. But the second thing is, secretly, I'm collecting these statistics on cycle time and throughput in the background. And if people are doing solo work on it, it kind of makes it no longer apples to apples comparisons. But those are kind of the guidelines. Other than that, in terms of their ceremonies and stuff, I'm literally asking them to change nothing else. So have your stand-ups, do your sprint planning, do your retrospectives, do your sprint reviews. Like, it's all good stuff, right? The fact that they're only doing this for 2 hours a day means that the hit on the team is relatively, like, I'm not asking them to turn their world upside down, just asking them to give it a try.
Right on. Yeah, Chris, did you have any more questions?
Oh yeah. So yeah, I find it interesting. So the impact on cycle time, throughput. Do you find that there's so much focus on velocity that talking about cycle time is more difficult, or how do you phrase that conversation when, and how does velocity help you argue for mobbing? I think that's an interesting point.
Yeah, well, so as the Agile guy in the room, that's what I get paid to do. Cycle time is a deep and compelling interest to me. Right. Yeah. That said, I understand others have other interests. Most of the managers that I run into only care about throughput. Right, that's their top of mind. The engineers I run into only care about quality and employee satisfaction. Right? But people have, it's not like nobody, we have people who exclusively care about one of these things. Just the emphasis changes from one person to another. The interest I get around cycle time, and if you don't care about cycle time, I understand, right? I think I can make a good argument from an Agile perspective for being very interested in it. But if you don't care and you're on a Scrum team, a lot of Scrum teams I run into, I ask them, show me your burn down chart. Some of your listeners may be more familiar with Agile stuff than not, but the burn down chart kind of shows what the team has gotten done during the sprint. And for a lot of teams, the burn down chart looks like a hockey stick. Nothing gets done until the very last minute of the sprint, and then everything gets done in the last day or two. By doing this, the team is in effect maximizing the amount of risk of failure in the sprint. Like literally, if nothing's done until the last minute, any tiny thing will blow it up and push you past the deadline there. So if you want to manage that risk appropriately, you'd really like to have stuff getting done all the time through the sprint. If that hockey stick is bugging you and you can't figure out a way of getting traction on that, the most consistent result I see in bringing mobbing into a Scrum team is a drastic reduction in cycle time. Incredible reduction in cycle time, which means that your burn down chart actually looks like a burn down chart, like you're burning stuff down rather as it goes on. For example, and I want to preface this by saying your team will be different, guaranteed, right? But I'm going to talk about, that's why we do the experiment, is to find exactly what the difference is for your team. But let me give you a little taste of some of the most typical results that I see from bringing this into Scrum teams. I had one team I worked with where their typical cycle time was 7 to 8 business days on average, right? So for a 2-week sprint, 10 business days in there, mostly stuff is getting done. We're in the middle of the second week. That's fairly typical for a lot of teams, right? When I brought in mobbing into this team, remember, we're doing 2 hours of mobbing each day. So 2 hours, 2 hours, 2 hours, 2 hours. In the first 8 hours of mobbing, so the equivalent of a business day, that team finished 3 user stories. So think about that for a second. If they had been doing wall-to-wall mobbing, they would have knocked out 3 user stories in their first day of the sprint. Results not guaranteed, right? But this is, I mean, the most common result is you see teams that have 6, 7, 8, 9 days to finish a user story, finishing them in 1, 2, 3 business days when they work together as a mob. Now, the flip side of that is, well, maybe they're going incredibly slowly. Like, what's the effect on throughput? Again, results not guaranteed here. The most common result I see when doing apples to apples comparison on this is that when they work together as a mob, they have a slight increase in their throughput, typically on the order of 15 to 25%. So they're actually going faster as a mob than they would be if I just let everyone go back to the cube and work solo on their stuff. Working together, they actually get more done, and they get what they get done faster.
That's fascinating. And I think what's sticking out to me too is all these like typical results, not guaranteed, as you've been saying,
yes, sure,
has happened with only 2 hours of mobbing a day. Because for me, I would be tempted, I think, to say like, hey, for those interested, let's mob all day. And so that it's like it gives mobbing a full shot, so to speak. And so how often is it only typically 2 hours? Is it consistent across all your experiments, or has that time varied for how much time they mob?
Yeah, so I'm a creature of habit, right? Well, also I want to get results I can compare between teams. So I tend to do things the same way, the same time. The reason why I chose 2 hours is that, number one, people say yes when I ask them for 2 hours. Like, that doesn't seem scary. And if it's a total disaster, which it never has been a total disaster, but if it was, then we've only blown up 1/4 of the sprint, right? And it's miserable for 2 hours a day, and anybody can stand that. So it's relatively low risk going in there. But I'm going with a language fluency model here. The pitch that I kind of give to teams is that this isn't just skill building. Think of it as learning how to talk about your work. The most common thing in the world is for me to work with people who have been in their field for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and they've never had an opportunity to actually talk about what they're doing because they're always working by themselves. I had a QA engineer. She had been a QA engineer for 10 years and got her in the mob for the first time. And they're working on the story for the first time, and they finished the coding and they're about to write some automated tests. She says, okay, we've got the test coded here. It's time to run it. So click on the foot. Click on the foot? Yeah, click on the foot, the button with the picture of the foot on it. Look at, sure enough, there's a button with a picture of a foot on it. Okay, click on that thing. But what is it? She doesn't know. She's been clicking on that button 100 times a day for the past 10 years. She's never actually had to express it. Being able to talk about your work is a lot of the skill of mobbing, and there's way more to it than that, right? But what they're doing is they're learning a language. They're learning how to express analysis, design, coding, testing to each other. And to do that, learning a language, having a little bit of practice every single day is more effective than a lot of practice once a week, is my theory, right? There are lots of ways to play this particular game, but that's how I that's a couple of the reasons why I take people on a 2-hour journey each day.
Yeah, and it's incremental as opposed to being thrown in the deep end, right? So, yes.
Well, there's another aspect to this as well, which is I say we'll be mobbing for 2 hours, and that's not true. So I'm utterly lying to these people. So number one, when you roll in the room, it takes people 5 minutes to sort of find their seat and find their place and people to trickle in. 5 more minutes for them to get oriented, to figure out what we're actually doing and get started. So that's 10 minutes off the front of the 2-hour chunk. On the end of it, however, I stop the session 20 minutes early. I bet you can guess why I stopped the session 20 minutes early, but I'll save you the awkwardness of guessing. We have a retrospective. Right. So the last 20 minutes of each 2-hour session is a retrospective where I say, what did you notice about this session? You've got 3 minutes on the clock. Put your stickies up. What do you notice? Boom, 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 boom. Great, fantastic. Now, okay, these look like they're friends. So I do a little affinity mapping. Okay, well, these live together. These are different. Okay, fantastic. And now out of this, which one of these groups seems the most significant to you? What do you want to have happen on this? Like, that one. Okay, great. What's the next action? What can we do the next time? Right. So going through this 2-hour, quote unquote, cycle, right? I'm actually every 2 hours have them do reflection, retrospection, and incremental improvement. If there's the one reason to do this for a month is that the most common result, aside from the cycle time thing, over the month-long period, is that they are doing things very different at the end of the month than they were in the beginning. I am very prescriptive in the first week, and I start loosening constraints as we go through until finally at the end, they're running the show on this. Yeah. But this is all driven by that once every 2 hours retrospection cycle going through.
Oh, fascinating. Fascinating. That's great. And so one thing I had was you also talked about personal satisfaction and impact on quality. Do you mind speaking more to quality?
Yeah. Well, so I mentioned that I collect quantitative results around this as much as I can. For the cycle time and throughput, I'm actually able to get hard figures as to how long things are taking and how much they're getting done. For the quality, I haven't really found a good quality measurement that I'm satisfied with, that I can truly get a hard number on at the end of a 1-month experiment. The best I've been able to do is in that final meeting where we're sort of presenting back the results and I'm asking them, what do you want to do about this? I ask them, from your perspective, how do you feel the quality was in working as a mob as compared to working in your usual mode? Do you feel like it was higher quality, lower quality, or about the same? And so I'd let them respond, just gut feel kind of thing. We haven't got a chance to get any of the usual metrics around defects that escape to production or anything like that. I'd love to get that kind of those figures, but I'm not smart enough to figure that out at this point. So in this case, I just do a gut check. Like, are you pumping out garbage here? Or is it as good? And what I get back is it's better or it feels about the same. And that's good enough for me, right? At least from the perspective of the engineers, they feel like they're doing about as well. They might be mistaken in that, who knows? But at least that I'm doing a gut check on that. With the employee satisfaction, I'm measuring it in the crudest possible way, which is at the end of this, I mentioned before that I say, if you don't stick up your hand on this, we're just going to forget this ever happened. It'll be a funny story for you to post on your blog, and we'll get on with our lives, right? But if you want to, your management has given the thumbs up that if you want to continue, I've checked with their management ahead of time. Your management has said, if you want to continue, you can continue. What would you like to do? So far, 100% of the teams that have tried it have chosen to continue in some form going forwards, which to me indicates that they don't hate it. Or if they do hate it, they're too embarrassed to admit it, right? Yeah. But they continue, they've opted to continue, which to me indicates that they're satisfied with it. Talking with people, watching them in the session, they seem excited, engaged. Many of them have expressed their pleasure with doing it. But I think the ultimate test is they choose to keep going. An interesting aspect of this is that the teams I've worked with I'm trying to think of an exception to this, but I think actually 100% of them have chosen to keep going, but they've also chosen to modify how they want to proceed going forward. They choose to do more during the day, or they choose to do less, or they choose to work on specific problems in this mode, or they choose to, they make it their own somehow. But the key test for me is, do they plan on abandoning it, or do they want to keep going? So that's kind of how I measure those two aspects.
All right on. And I think that was the original story, Chris, right? When the mobbing was, so to speak, discovered about 10 years ago, was the day ended and it was like, do we want to keep doing it? Yes.
Yeah. It was just every day we asked ourselves the same question, retro at the end of the day. And yeah, it was great. So we also have this topic on here, the twin principles of invitation and experimentation as applied to mobbing. And so I think we've talked a little bit about both invitation and experimentation, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that, and I guess what experiments and other things have you seen that you might find interesting or you want to call out?
Oh yeah, well, so the key principles. So number one, shout out to Daniel Mezek. He's the one that I've stolen these from. I've stolen them from him because number one, he's still got them, right? So when you steal an idea, we both have it. But they're also incredibly effective here. I am not coming in and I'm not rolling up on people and saying, yo, now you have to work XYZ, particularly in such an intimate practice as mobbing. This is something that is your job. Like it's not part of your job. It is your job. And I'm coming into people who are literally world experts on doing their job in this way, in this company at this moment in history. Who am I to come in and tell them to do X, Y, Z? I'm definitely not their manager, right? The only power I have is the possibility of walking in on them and inviting them in. And saying, I am authorized to give you some of my time. Your management has told me that I can come in and help you out with this particular thing if you want to. Here are some things that I think might happen, but I don't know for sure. Why don't we come in and give it a try? And that's where the second aspect is, which is experimentation. I'm not asking you to make a policy change here. I'm just asking you to try it. Let's do an experiment, see what the results are. And then if you think you like it, then you can decide if you want to try. And maybe you get to the end of this and say, you know what, we like it, it's not good enough. It's good, but it's not good enough. But maybe you want to continue. And that is, I think, crucial in allowing people to fairly consider a practice like mobbing, or really any practice that you might want to bring into a team, is to allow them to opt out, to say, thanks, but no thanks. You're a cool guy, not for us at this moment. Or be able to say, yeah, we've tried it, but it's not for us. That's not just a effective way of working. I think it's a humane way of working. We could have a whole conversation as to why allowing people the option to determine their own work is actually a fair and ethical way of working. But just know that it certainly doesn't seem evil to me. And I think I can make a good case that it's actually a good way to do business. So that's kind of where I come from in terms of how I practice this. In terms of other experiments that you could do on this, obviously a 1-month experiment is very limited. The teams that I work with are rapidly changing when I leave them, right? There are results, Llewellyn Falco mentioned the teams he worked with, he saw changes happening, I think around 180 days. Like 6 months in, all of a sudden, the teams make a big jump in terms of their performance. I could be totally misremembering that, but I'm sure he'll come back and say, no, it wasn't me. That was somebody else. But there's the teams I work with are in the process of learning the language. They're just in the baby steps. The mob is just starting to gel. They're starting to discover some of the cool parts. So what happens in month 2? What happens in month 3? What happens if they start taking this on as a practice? So 2 hours is not very long, particularly when they only have 1.5 hours to actually code together. Like what happens if they start extending that to a 4-hour chunk, full day chunk, right? Other tensions, other stresses start coming in. We never get to the moment where people get exhausted, right? This can be a very exhausting practice because it's a very intense practice unless you're consciously building in breaks. We never reach that point with the experiment as I set it up. All kinds of fun stuff you could be doing around this, which we never get to in the experiments as I set them up.
Yeah. No, that's very fair. And I think I love we've talked about it before with diffusion of innovation, in that I like how you call it the twin principles of invitation experimentation, because I think that really puts people's guard down, right?
Yeah.
as opposed to, I am the Agile commander and you shall obey me, kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Some of us have seen that before, which might be a walking contradiction. But and one thing that you shared earlier on the quality side really stuck with me, because when I had done Scrum before, the one quality problem that I really struggled with inside Scrum was it was that hockey stick with the burn down you were talking about, right?
Yeah.
And it was basically, people would be like, yeah, test-driven development sounds great. Like doing these, kind of refactoring is awesome. And then it becomes the last day of the sprint. And then it's just like everything goes to the wayside and everyone's rubber stamping everyone else's code review. And these are people who are really well-intentioned. It's just, and we would, I remember it was me and someone else were basically saying like, the end of the sprint is not a deadline. You know what I mean? And it was just the idea of the end of the sprint caused so much, quality issues, and I think stress for people, right? It was like the beginning of the sprint was like this ease and like, oh yeah, we're having a good time, we're working stuff. And then the end, it was like the roller coaster is going downhill and everyone's like, And what you were talking about with the burn down, where mobbing helped alleviate that pressure at the very end, right? Is if you're getting things done throughout, it's like at the end, oh, we didn't complete this one story. Oh, well, there's next sprint, as opposed to, oh, this sprint we got done 5 points and last sprint we got done at 110. Like that looks terrible, right? And so
yeah. Well, Scrum is very cleverly designed, right? It's very cleverly designed to put teams in situations where they can, perhaps for the first time, collaborate with one another effectively, way more closely than they have in the past. One of the ways that Scrum does that is by limiting work in progress. You're not allowed to get your own thing and drag it off into the corner, work on your one thing and have a big handoff to somebody else, because we're all working together on a very limited set of things. Scrum limits what you do to what you think you can get done in a 2-week period. This is a drastic reduction in work in progress in most environments. Most people are working on everything all the time. Literally hundreds of things simultaneously. I've been at clients where 500 things were going on simultaneously. It's crazy. So Scrum is a huge revolution in reducing work in progress. When you're working, but it's a great leap forward, but it's not the end. How can we reduce that work in progress even further? When you work together as a mob, your work in progress is one. For your team, you are working on one thing at any given moment. So when you're working together in that way, the pressures and the psychological pressures, both positive and negative, that Scrum puts on you fade away a lot more, because your work in progress is being handled in other ways, simply by virtue of working together as a mob. So we work on this story and we finish it. We work on this story, we finish it. We work on this story and we finish it. Finished. We get to the last day of the sprint. We're working on a story. Oh, we ran out of time. Okay, well, it's just one story, right? it's the only thing we have in progress. We're not tempted to sort of shove on through the weekend. We're not tempted to cut corners. We just keep moving on and moving on. Now, some of the psychological pressures start to work in our favor. And it starts to become more of a planning model than the kind of thing where we're working towards some sort of arbitrary deadline. And it can, I think it can have positive effects on teams. This is mostly conjecture on my part, based on seeing other Scrum teams work. I haven't worked in teams where a Scrum team that was exclusively using mobbing. I think that would be fascinating. But I think you would find that a team that was working exclusively as a mob, or mostly exclusively, would find a lot of the Scrum events to reduce in importance and maybe disappear entirely. We have a daily Scrum where we do planning and coordination for the next 24 hours. How much planning and coordination for the next 24 hours do you need as a mob? And the answer is, well, how far out of alignment are we? The answer is 0. Like if you went to the bathroom, then you need to catch up on the last 6 minutes. That's how far of alignment you are, right? So do we still need to have daily Scrum? Maybe, but it might change drastically. Sprint planning. What does that look like for a team that works together as a mob? Sprint review. What does that look? All of these things would shift, perhaps drastically. I think that is yet to be explored by me. Maybe other people are doing this every day, and we've got Scrum teams out there that are working as mobs on a consistent basis. I would be very interested to see that, but it's not something I have direct experience with yet.
Fascinating. Cool. Any other questions before we close, Chris?
No, I just want to second that idea that the single piece flow, making nicer looking burn down charts, like it's just a fascinating idea, because I don't think about burn down charts too often, but that's probably something that I'll quote you on in the future. So
yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So we'll give you a chance to plug something here, but I thought I would ask one just as far as authenticity goes. It's always good to share things when they don't work out so well. What would you say has been, since it's just an experiment, and since we're just trying stuff, have you what's kind of the worst you've seen happen in this experiment?
Yeah. Well, so I can give you a couple of negatives. Maybe this is people who might be interested in doing this kind of experiment need to know what the costs are of working this way. Number one, during this experiment, I commit to spending 2 hours every day for a month as facilitator in this, which is a lot of a very expensive, highly talented person standing in a room facilitating people. Is that necessary? I don't know. Teams seem to do pretty well with me in the room, and I've always got something to say in there. Maybe they do even better without me, but having a facilitator there who has experience to help them along is a cost and would probably reduce the risk of the whole thing crashing and burning. So that's one thing. Second thing, has this ever gone terribly wrong? It's never gone terribly wrong. I had one team, the worst result I ever got on throughput was a team reduced their throughput by 50%. So they were moving half speed when they worked together as a mob. One team had that happen. Don't know how, I don't know why. Maybe they were super high performing before and they were taking, I don't know what that was. But your safety is not guaranteed here. Try it and see what you think. Now, that said, there were 6 people on this team. So moving half speed, still, they weren't moving 1/6 the speed. So something was going on there. I would encourage you to try it and measure for yourself. The third thing is that you need to invest in people working together. And it's a weird company that is really on point in terms of investing in the resources to have people collaborate to this level. When we get back in the office, you need to plan to have a room for people to get together, and a room with a large screen that everybody can see at the same time. We're not going to be getting back together to work for a while. So you need to be on your A game with regards to collaboration software, things like Zoom, things like screen sharing, setting up development environments so that people can work together effectively. You're not going to get it right the first time. You need to listen to your people and give them the tools and support they need, and then trust them to get the job done. That phrasing came to mind for some reason. I have no idea where that came from or why. But you need to take that seriously. Tools and support are crucial. Invest in them and ignore them to your peril.
Right on. Well, thank you so much for sharing. Before we close the show, is there anything you'd like to share or plug?
I would like to plug a concept here, which is this might be sound interesting to you. You might be super enthusiastic. You might not be enthusiastic. You might be just puzzled as to why someone might want to try this. I want to ask you to give it a try. Do the experiment. Don't think about it. Don't try to figure out ahead of time what this is going to be. Don't try to say, well, how could this possibly work? Just the answer that I always tell people when they ask me that is, I don't know. Can this work for your team? Beats me. Try it. Give it a try. Try working in this mode. Try it with your team. All you have to do is try it barely long enough to see if you like it enough to keep going. Try it long enough to see whether you're getting the kind of results you want. And if you try it and you don't like it, please talk to Austin, talk to Chris. They would love to hear from you about mob programming gone wrong. I would love to hear that episode. But also, if you try it and it goes really well for you, please get on the Mob Mentality podcast, because I want to hear about your experiments. The most important thing you can do is to actually try these ideas in your environment, find their strengths, find their weaknesses for yourself.
Yeah, that's a great call to action. So thank you there, Dan.
Thank you. All right.
So, yeah.
To all of our audience, run the experiment, try the experiment, and as Dan is suggesting, and if you think that this would help broaden somebody's horizons on the experimentation mindset, please send this episode over to them. Sharing it helps kind of spread the word. And otherwise, like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much. And thank you, Dan, for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.